All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back for the second part of Section 9 on prisons and punishment. And we're going to start by talking about incarceration rates. So, the usual way to talk about how many people are incarcerated in any given area is to talk about rates per 100,000, which we've done on a few other subjects already in this course. But there are some definitional problems here as well, just like there were with recidivism just a minute ago. So first of all, if we say, number of people imprisoned per 100,000, do we mean per 100,000 total people or per 100,000 adults? Some people measure it one way, some people measure it the other, because you don't want, people under 18 who aren't subject to incarceration in a prison anyways. Do we want to kind of include them in the denominator part of the equation, or only those people who are subject to incarceration in the first place, which would be usually people over 18? The other problem is, what's incarceration, right? So does pretrial detention count? Does home confinement count? We can probably all agree that being in prison probably counts as incarceration, but beyond that, there's a lot of kind of iffy situations where we're not quite sure whether it counts as incarceration or not. Now, when we choose one way to define it, we can then compare country to country to country. And in this case, USA is number one. With one possible exception, which we'll talk about in a minute, the United States has by far the highest incarceration rate in the world. We have 639 per 100,000. And again, comparing apples to apples, using the same definition of incarceration, you can see there a list of countries that have far, 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 far fewer of their people incarcerated than we do here in the United States. Iceland is one of the lowest in the world with only 33 per 100,000. But this is just kind of a random gathering of countries where I could find data measured in the same way, and was able to pull these out. I wanted to get kind of a good representation from all over the world, rich countries, poor countries, Western countries, Eastern countries, et cetera, et cetera. But this is kind of a general picture of how many people are incarcerated in different parts of the world. Now, the one possible exception here is China. China, I think their official number is something around 112 or 200 and something, somewhere in there, right around the kind of global average. But the problem is, this doesn't count a huge number of people that we're pretty sure, nigh on positive, that China is imprisoning, but they aren't giving us those numbers as part of their official numbers. So it's kind of hard to tell exactly how many people China imprisons. For instance, we know they're not counting all of the pre-sentence detention people, which, as we talked about in a previous section, is a lot of people, because they use pre-sentence or pre-trial detention gratuitously, to say it nicely. Now, Rwanda is another special case. Rwanda, again, as we discussed in a previous section, had this really huge, really disturbing genocide in the mid-90s. And as such, in the late 90s, early 2000s, they had a lot of people in pretrial detention and incarcerated and going through the trial system because of kind of the aftermath of that genocide. So in 2002, it was 1,382, which is more than double the current United States incarceration rate. But it's way, way, way down today. It's only 511, which is still on the higher end, but way below what it was as recently as 20 years ago. So they have seen a vast an intense shift in their incarceration rate, and that is a very interesting situation from both a human rights perspective and from a criminology perspective. Now, one interesting thing is that globally, women make up a very, very small percentage of incarcerated people, generally from 2 to 9%. But interestingly, this is rising. And this is something we're seeing all over the world, is that women are making up a higher percentage of criminals. You know, even over the past 20, 30, 40 years, women have gone from nigh on 0% of criminals up to, you know, the rates, let's just say the rates of women and men committing crime are converging. They're getting closer and closer together. And there are lots of different reasons for this, lots of different theories, lots of different ideas that different criminologists have put forth about why there's this big difference, but you know, why there was this big difference between offending by men and women, and why that is closing ever so exonerably, extricably, what's the word I'm looking for? Smoothly, right? I mean, as you can see from here, this is arrests in the United States, which is not exactly imprisonment worldwide, but it's the same kind of pattern that shows that, you know, the crime by women and men is becoming more and more and more similar. Now, what explains crime rates? Or I'm sorry, not crime rates, imprisonment rates, incarceration rates. What can explain why we have more or fewer people incarcerated in any given place in any given time? Well, first is prison capacity. If you build it, they will come, right? The more people we can put in prison, the more people we're able to put in prison, the more people are going to be sentenced to prison. There's public opinion, right? If people want more tough on crime, we want more people, we want more bad guys behind bars. You'll have more bad guys behind bars. Legislation. If you change legislation to increase punishments or increase the number of acts that count as a crime, you're going to get more people in prison. The judiciary. If judges are more likely to sentence people to prison rather than, say, rehab or other diversion programs, you're going to get more people in prison. Forensic science. The more we're able to catch people who commit crime and prove that it was them that did it, the more people we're going to get sentenced to prison. And then there's the availability of alternatives. Are there diversion programs that we can use? But importantly, and kind of disturbingly, it doesn't seem to be well connected to the crime rate. And up here we have a graph that kind of shows that for the United States, but this is kind of a worldwide thing. Crime rates and incarceration rates don't seem to be well coordinated. When one goes up or down, the other kind of does its own thing. And that's kind of interesting and weird, because you would think that as crime goes up, we would incarcerate more people, and as crime goes down, we would incarcerate fewer people, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Part of the reason we had this huge increase in worldwide incarceration rates in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century was what criminologists call the punitive turn, which really started in the United States. And in the last quarter century, the United States increased its prison population by 500%. And that's inflation, or not inflation adjusted, population rise adjusted. And part of this is due to politics, right? Again, we pointed out earlier, but this picture is from the 1988 Bush-Dukakis presidential election, where essentially the reason Dukakis lost was crime. He was seen as soft on crime, and people in the, you know, especially the 80s, but throughout the last 100 years, Americans have wanted tough on crime, more guards, more bars. And thus the politicians kind of followed what the people wanted rather than what criminology really had to say. And this led to a lot of net widening, right? What used to be civil matters, or what used to be punishable by a fine, is now punishable by prison. So what does it mean to be a prison populism, right? The politicians care about what the voters think about crime and prison and imprisonment rather than what actually happens and what the data actually shows. And this graph here, you can see Americans are pretty bad at understanding what's going on with crime. As crime has decreased over the past 20, 30 years, people's perception of crime has not gone the same way, right? So politicians pay attention to the Americans' perception of crime rather than the actual crime rate. So these are three features of that prison populism that politicians really pay attention to. So excessive concern with the public perception of a policy rather than the realities of that policy. Intentional or negligent disregard for evidence, i.e. what actually happens doesn't matter. And then a simplistic assumption about public perception, right? So just saying, oh, Americans don't want any gun control, which is a simplistic assumption because there are lots of gun control measures that are indeed very unpopular, but there are lots of gun control measures like universal background checks that are incredibly popular. So when you make these simplistic assumptions, it can give you kind of a bad idea of what people actually want, and what people actually want can give you a bad idea of what is actually effective. In other countries, notably the Scandinavian countries, they go for more of a normalization process. They want their prisons to be more like normal life. And one of the reasons here is both education about what normal life can look like. Ooh, man, there's a storm coming. I better finish up with this quick. And to increase the stakes in conformity, right? We want people to kind of have as normal a life as possible so that they see a benefit in not committing crimes in the future. Now, interestingly, voting methods in any given country seem to really influence the prison rate. Now, in countries with first past the post voting, which are these countries in red, essentially first past the post voting kind of necessitates or at least heavily influences a two-party system. So it becomes us versus them, and it's all about kind of the battle between those two major parties. With proportional representation systems in blue and pink above, it's more about consensus building and figuring out kind of how we can all work together. And this method of voting and legislation and representation seems to have a pretty decent impact on how many people become imprisoned. When you are all about building consensus, you find diversion programs an alternative to prison, whereas if you're used to conflict, you're much more likely to have high prison rates. Now, does it work? Does imprisonment work? Well, there's the recidivism problem again, right? So we're going to measure whether imprisonment works by recidivism, usually, as we talked about earlier. But once again, we get to how do we define recidivism, right? Is it rearrest or reconviction or return to prison? Is it the same crime or is it any crime? And then there's how do we measure recidivism, right? So there's lots of different issues that can come with measuring whether someone's been rearrested or not. What if, it's difficult to say that Bob, who served prison time in Texas and then got rearrested 5 years later in Maine, well, it might be hard to connect the Bob who spent prison time in Texas to the Bob from Maine for these official statistics. And then, of course, there's the problem that almost nobody in the world publishes data on recidivism. There's lots and lots of public data on things like crime rates, country to country to country, but recidivism is something that countries just don't publish a lot of data on. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about here is crimmigration, which is the kind of fancy word, new word, talking about the criminalization of immigration. And one of the things that this punitive turn in the USA did was take things that weren't traditionally seen as criminal and turn them criminal. For instance, immigration. Now, under United States law, being in this country illegally is not a criminal act. It is a civil violation. But due to this punitive turn and the focus on prison, 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 punish the bad guys, punish the bad guys, punish the bad guys, we started to see immigration as a criminal problem. And we took this civil violation, being in the country illegally, and turned it into a crime. Not officially, but in our heads, in our kind of policies, in our political zeitgeist. Being here illegally is now seen as a crime when legally it's not. Similarly, seeking asylum via international law, any person seeking asylum can enter the country in violation of that country's immigration laws, and then seek asylum once they're in the country legally or illegally. And that, especially in the presidency of Donald Trump, was even more criminalized, and this civil matter, or even something that's not illegal at all in the case of asylum seekers, was treated as criminal, and the people were punished as criminals despite the fact that they had not violated any criminal law. And one of the reasons for this is because it's popularly seen that illegal immigrants are criminals and will commit other crimes while they're here. And do some of them commit other crimes? Of course. They're people. Any large enough group of people is going to commit some amount of crime. But in reality, people who are in the country illegally have a much lower crime rate than the general public. So, if people, the general rate of homicide or sexual assault or simple assault or car theft is here, the rate for that same crime for people in the country illegally are usually significantly below that rate. Which most people just kind of don't, they think, oh, certainly if they're in this country illegally, they must be committing other crimes too. But no, the data tells us the exact opposite. But they're outsiders, right? They're not one of us, they're one of them, thus they're scary, and their culture is strange, and their actions are strange, and we don't want them here. And that's kind of a worldwide thing. That's not unique to the United States. There are lots and lots of countries that see immigrants, legal or illegal or otherwise, as outsiders and don't want them there. And this results in a lot of things, right? Like deportation, even in cases where it doesn't seem to be fair. And that can be situations where, like, somebody who was brought illegally into the country as a very small child and spent the last 20 years growing up in the country, has only ever really known that country, only knows their language, but is technically not a citizen. Deporting them back to the country they were born in but have no memory of, and no support structure, and no job, and maybe don't even speak the language, because of this kind of crimmigration philosophy, it happens even then. There are numerous people of non-American citizenship that have served honorably in our military, and then as soon as they were discharged, were deported because they're not U.S. citizens here legally. So we let them serve in our armed forces for 4 years or 8 years or however long, and then immediately deported them upon completion of their service, which doesn't seem fair to me, at least in my opinion. And this is not unique to the United States. In France recently, they banned the burqa, which is a traditional outfit worn by Muslims in many of the different Muslim sects, because they see the burqa as different and worn by outsiders. So they want to kind of take away their right to dress in the way they want, in order to kind of prevent them from being so obviously other. There are many places, both in the United States and in other countries, where they've enacted language bans, right? So you're not allowed to speak a foreign language in a public place. You're not allowed to have foreign languages. Government documents have to be printed in the dominant language of the area rather than any foreign languages. And then, of course, there's ethnic profiling, right? This was very, very obvious in the United States post 9/11, where anybody who had slightly dark skin was seen as a potential terrorist. But when it happens on the part of the general populace, it's sad and depressing, but not exactly a institutional problem. But when it happens via institutions like the police, then it becomes a very, very serious legal issue. Should police be able to kind of profile, say, somebody driving a car down the street, otherwise following the law? Should they be able to profile that person based on the color of their skin? So this process is one that's ongoing. It's one that's being studied. It's one that's, I think, very important because humanity is increasingly being able to travel from place to place to place and immigrate or emigrate from one place to another easier and easier and easier, legally or illegally. So this is an issue that is going to become more and more and more studied and discussed, and people are going to become more afraid. But this is one of those times where we really, I think, in my opinion, need to look at what is actually happening. Let's not look at what people are afraid of. Let's look at what's actually happening. And with that, that is the end of section 9. I really appreciate you guys viewing. I will see you for the next one.